July 2019. A heavy, humid air blanketed Douglas Lake, Tennessee. The water level receded deeply, exposing a layer of black mud that had lain dormant for over 4 decades. Under the scorching southern sun, the glint of steel shovels, wielded by a dam maintenance crew, suddenly caught something extraordinary. One worker bent down, gently pulling at a damp piece of fabric. Beneath it was something no one in their lifetime would wish to see. "Dispatch, I need a crime scene unit and forensics at Douglas Lake immediately." The crew leader's voice crackled over the radio, choking at the end of the sentence. What had seemed like a routine inspection had now turned into a true nightmare, one that would answer a question haunting Sevier County for over 40 years. 2 decayed bundles of fabric were unearthed, tightly bound with rope, containing human bones, laid side by side. Nearby was a silver bracelet engraved with LC and a scrap of red fabric, details that eerily matched a long-forgotten missing persons case from 1976. Linda Carver and Maria Castillo, 2 young women who left Knoxville one night to attend a party at a lakeside cabin, then vanished without a trace. 2 students, one in photography, the other in interior design, once known throughout the town for their smiles and unfinished dreams. Their beige Ford Bronco was found by the water's edge, door open, keys still inside, but they were gone. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no explanation. The case was classified as missing persons, possible foul play, and then faded into obscurity. Sheriff Earl Wallace had retired with the lingering regret that those 2 girls never left Douglas Lake, and now the lake had just proven him right. This discovery didn't just reopen a missing persons case, it reignited an entire Tennessee memory of a deadly summer. Old files were pulled out, the dust of time blown away, and all eyes turned to David Pierce, a man who called himself a music producer and had hosted the last party the 2 girls attended. For 43 years, Pierce had lived in Sevierville, blending into the community, attending church, and participating in memorials for the very victims he was once questioned about. No one suspected that he was still carrying that horrific secret. The Douglas Lake case isn't just a story of 2 missing girls. It's a slice of 1970s America, where trust, guilt, and silence coexisted in small communities. It's a story of a sheriff who never gave up, a young investigator daring to dig into the past, and DNA technology that allowed silent voices to be heard after nearly half a century. Before we continue this shocking story, please hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring forgotten cases to light, and the algorithms will ensure you don't miss any cold cases in the future. Because what was found at the bottom of Douglas Lake wasn't just bones, it was a buried truth, concealed lies, and justice delayed far too long. This case doesn't end at the scene. It's the first domino to fall, triggering a chain of events that expose secrets long buried beneath Tennessee's waters for nearly half a century. When authorities finally made an arrest in 2020, the suspect wasn't a stranger or an anonymous shadow. It was someone the community had trusted, called by a familiar name, greeted every Sunday morning. The Douglas Lake case isn't just a solved mystery, it's a testament to persistence, to the belief that time can fade everything, except justice. When Linda and Maria disappeared, the town of Sevierville was torn apart. Neighbors stopped trusting each other, stopped waving, and for years, every summer, they avoided mentioning the girls' names. But then, like the lake receding after 4 decades, the truth finally surfaced. What makes this case particularly haunting is that the answer was never far away. It was only buried in the mud and in the memories of a community that had chosen silence for too long. Tonight, we'll return to the summer of 1976, walk through every detail of the investigation that lay dormant, and follow the recovered evidence to understand why 2 young women vanished in the heart of Tennessee's waters. This is a story of loss, persistence, deception, and justice delayed, but not denied. Summer 1976. The outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee, were bathed in harsh sunlight and red dirt roads leading to Douglas Lake, where families camped and young people gathered every weekend. In a small dorm near the University of Tennessee, Linda Carver, a 21-year-old photography student, prepared for a weekend evening. She lived with Maria Castillo, a 23-year-old Mexican student studying interior design. The two were close, often attending student parties or local events together. That evening, they accepted an invitation to a summer party at a lakeside cabin, hosted by David Pierce, a man in his mid-30s who introduced himself as a country music producer. Linda brought her Polaroid camera, and Maria wore her favorite red dress. Neighbors recalled seeing them leave their apartment in the beige Ford Bronco, music blaring as the car turned onto the main road heading south, where the sunset's glow reflected on the water. The night passed, and neither girl returned. The next morning, Linda's mother called, but no one answered. When she visited the apartment, she found empty beds, neatly folded clothes, and an untouched dinner from the night before. Maria hadn't attended class or contacted friends. By noon, acquaintances began searching near the lake, but found no trace. Calls were made to hospitals and local police stations, all yielding no information. As the afternoon wore on, worry turned to panic. Finally, as the sunlight faded behind the hills, Linda's mother drove to the Sevier County Sheriff's Office. She stepped up to the desk, her voice hoarse, after a long day of desperate searching. "My daughter and her friend are missing." The duty officer took down the details and passed the report to Sheriff Earl Wallace, who had served the county for nearly 20 years. Wallace quickly reviewed the statement, noting an anomaly: 2 young women missing together, with their vehicle, carrying little luggage. He immediately opened an official missing persons case and ordered a search to begin as soon as possible. In a brief command room meeting, Wallace divided the patrol teams. One group scoured the route from the student housing in Knoxville to Douglas Lake. Another contacted hospitals, motels, and gas stations to check for anyone matching Linda Carver and Maria Castillo's descriptions. Officers were instructed to note every detail, no matter how small, as Wallace believed this was not an ordinary missing persons case. The search began the next morning. The temperature neared 90 degrees, the sun beating down on the dirt roads leading to the lake. Police and volunteers fanned out in lines, moving along the pine forest's edge, calling the girls' names, occasionally stopping to examine tire tracks or scraps of fabric. Divers from Jefferson City were called in to check the deep waters near the eastern dock, where locals often moored boats. In the murky lake, they found nothing but rusted cans and abandoned fishing nets. On shore, officers checked temporary parking lots, gas stations, and small bars in the area, but no one recalled seeing women matching the description. On the second day, Wallace personally visited the cabin where the party was held. The owner, David Pierce, was a well-dressed, calm-spoken man in his mid-30s. He claimed the party ended before midnight, and the 2 girls left normally, driving their Ford Bronco. When Wallace asked if anyone left with them, Pierce said no, adding that they probably just got home late. As he left the cabin, Wallace found no signs of a struggle or unusual items, but something about the man's indifference nagged at him. On the third day, the search expanded to a 10-mile radius around the lake. A group headed west, following a narrow dirt road parallel to the water's edge. There, a local, a man who owned an old wooden house overlooking the lake, approached them. He mentioned seeing a light-colored vehicle parked near the water's edge early that morning, assuming it belonged to a fisherman, but no one returned all day. Wallace heard the report over the radio and immediately left his office. The described vehicle matched the one in the missing persons file. The road to the lake's edge was muddy and mossy, flanked by tall grass. When the patrol car stopped, Wallace spotted a beige object glinting through the low trees. He approached and recognized the Ford Bronco, parked precariously close to the water, its front facing the lake. The driver's door was ajar, keys still in the ignition, the front seat pulled back as if someone had left in a hurry. No one was inside or around the vehicle. When the investigation team arrived, Wallace signaled to preserve the scene. He walked around the vehicle, noting deep tire tracks in the soft ground, stretching from the dirt road above to the water's edge, then stopping abruptly. No long skid marks, no broken glass, no signs of a crash. This led Wallace to rule out an accident immediately. Inside the vehicle, Linda's purse sat on the passenger seat, its zipper partially open. It contained a wallet, some receipts, a lipstick, and her student ID. On the floor, Maria's thin jacket was draped over the pedal, its edge crusted with dried mud. In the back, the Polaroid camera lay scattered with an unprocessed film roll. Everything seemed untouched, undisturbed. Wallace jotted notes quickly, then ordered the forensics team to cordon off a 20-meter radius to collect soil samples, photograph the scene, and mark any suspicious traces. The Knoxville forensics team arrived that afternoon. They began measuring, noting temperature, wind direction, and ground conditions. A technician detected a strong whiskey odor in the cabin. The air filter retained a heavy alcohol scent, suggesting someone had been drinking in the vehicle shortly before leaving. A faint fingerprint smudge was on the steering wheel, but not clear enough for on-site identification. Otherwise, there were no blood stains or signs of a struggle. Seats were neat, mirrors intact, doors unscratched. An empty whiskey bottle lay under the floor, its label faded, origin untraceable. Outside, a few steps from the vehicle's rear, Wallace noticed a series of faint boot prints in the mud. They were large, possibly a man's, resembling the cowboy boots common in the area. The prints led toward the dirt road, then vanished in the tall grass. Any traces of the girls, if there were any, had been erased by the receding water and wind. The area around the vehicle was completely quiet, with no signs of a struggle or escape. The forensics team continued collecting samples, soil from the tires, a small fiber on the door handle, and a pale handkerchief tucked under the seat, embroidered with MC on the edge. Wallace observed silently. Every detail in the vehicle suggested someone had stopped deliberately, not randomly. The vehicle hadn't plunged into the lake or skidded. It sat neatly by the water's edge, as if placed there and abandoned. After documenting the scene, Wallace ordered the area cordoned off with police tape and a preliminary report drafted. He cross-checked the missing persons file, confirming the vehicle's license plate matched the Ford Bronco registered to Linda Carver. The items inside matched the descriptions provided by her mother. No bodies, no signs of violence, but everything suggested this wasn't a simple runaway or accident case. Standing by the mirror-like lake, Wallace wrote a brief note in his notebook. Vehicle found intact, belongings untouched, no signs of collision. Scene suggests deliberate staging. With his experience, he knew such cases rarely resolved quickly. The vehicle might sit silently by the water, but behind it was a larger void, where two young women had vanished without a trace. After the vehicle was towed from the muddy edge and sealed, Wallace returned to the station to focus on reconstructing the last night Linda and Maria were seen. He compiled a list of everyone at the lakeside cabin party hosted by David Pierce. The list included 12 people, mostly Pierce's friends in the local music scene, some known only through intermediaries. Within 2 days, Wallace and his deputy interviewed each one. All accounts aligned on one point: Linda and Maria left the party with Pierce and his close friend Brian Osborne sometime after midnight. No one recalled the exact time, but one woman said she saw them step outside, talking near Pierce's truck before heading toward the main road together. After that, no one saw the girls again. When summoned for questioning, David Pierce appeared with an oddly calm demeanor. Dressed neatly, he answered each question concisely, without evasion. Pierce said the party was just a casual gathering with music and drinks, and everyone left on their own. When Wallace asked if he was the last to leave the cabin, Pierce said he only walked them to the main road before returning to clean up. He described it as a polite gesture, insisting the girls were sober and cheerful when they got into their vehicle. When asked why he didn't report their disappearance, he shrugged. "I thought they made it home." His even tone and lack of concern struck Wallace as off. Police ran a background check on Pierce. He had lived in Memphis and was investigated in 1975 after a woman accused him of drugging her at a party he hosted. That case lacked clear evidence. The victim survived but refused to testify, and the file was closed. Otherwise, Pierce had no serious criminal record. He currently rented the lakeside cabin as a temporary studio, occasionally lending it to friends for weekend stays. Wallace noted the information and ordered a check on Brian Osborne, Pierce's friend that night. Osborne, a longtime friend, worked at a local instrument repair shop. He confirmed attending the party, having a few drinks, and leaving early. When asked about the girls, he said they were still with Pierce when he left. His statement matched others, but didn't pinpoint when they left the cabin. Wallace requested a warrant to search Pierce's cabin, citing it as possibly the last place the victims were seen. However, the county prosecutor denied it due to insufficient criminal grounds. Without a body or signs of violence, there wasn't enough to classify it as a homicide or kidnapping. Wallace knew this was a common hurdle in witnessless missing persons cases. Still convinced the cabin was key, he sent 2 officers to walk the property, photograph the exterior, and map the terrain. But they stopped at the door without a warrant. In the days that followed, Wallace gathered more information about Pierce from locals in the area. Some said they had heard music and laughter at the cabin for several nights, but others mentioned seeing him frequently bring young women from Knoxville who would leave very late. No one reported any trouble, only noting that he lived quietly and was a bit odd. The more Wallace reviewed old files, the more he sensed a pattern in Pierce's behavior: hosting parties, serving alcohol, appearing with young women, and then isolating them from the group. He returned to the vehicle's discovery site once more, searching for any trace linking the cabin to the lake's western shore. The dirt road from the cabin to where the vehicle was found was just over a mile long, close enough for someone to drive in a few minutes. Wallace marked this route on his map, drawing an arrow connecting the cabin to the vehicle's stopping point. To him, this short distance was the only link between the party and the disappearance of the 2 women. In his preliminary report to the state police, Wallace concluded, the victims were last seen with David Pierce and Brian Osborne. Both men deny involvement, but their statements conflict regarding the time they left the cabin. The case was classified as missing persons, possible foul play, indicating suspicious circumstances with potential criminal activity. Wallace knew that without additional physical evidence, the investigation would soon stall. Still, he added a personal note at the end of the report. The man named Pierce is not just a party host, he knows more than he's saying. The items collected from the Ford Bronco were sent to the Tennessee State Forensics Lab in early August 1976. Among them, the whiskey bottle and 2 glass cups were prioritized for analysis. The report, returned after 2 weeks, confirmed the presence of phenobarbital, a potent sedative typically prescribed for neurological conditions or severe insomnia, in the whiskey. The detected dosage exceeded standard therapeutic levels, sufficient to cause drowsiness, dizziness, and unconsciousness if consumed with alcohol. This immediately caught Wallace's attention, as alcohol was freely served and uncontrolled at Pierce's party. The presence of a sedative in the whiskey suggested someone had deliberately spiked it. When analyzing fingerprints, the forensics lab found 2 primary sets on the bottle and cups. One matched Linda Carver, based on samples provided by her mother. The other matched David Pierce, the party host. Maria's prints were faint and inconclusive. While these fingerprints could be explained as shared use of glasses at the party, Wallace considered their presence significant, as they proved Pierce had directly handled the bottle found in the victim's vehicle. Beyond this, the remaining samples showed no signs of violence. No blood, hair, or unfamiliar fibers were found. The vehicle's interior showed no signs of a struggle. The steering wheel, seats, and doors were clean and smooth. The forensics team concluded the scene was well preserved or undisturbed post-incident. This left Wallace in a difficult position. The evidence pointed to the involvement of another party, but didn't confirm a specific crime. Without a body, witnesses, or grounds for criminal charges, the case remained stuck. Wallace ordered another underwater search, focusing on the area near the vehicle's location. The dive team used old sonar equipment, scanning continuously for 2 days. However, Douglas Lake was vast, with a complex lakebed full of deep crevices and thick mud that weakened sonar signals. The results showed only blurry images, with no objects resembling human bodies. Some areas were marked for manual inspection, but nothing was found beyond a few metal scraps and driftwood. The sonar report was filed with a comprehensive forensics report, stating, "No bodies or evidence of a vehicle being dragged underwater were detected." This reinforced the belief that the vehicle was placed at the lake's edge, not fallen or driven in. To Wallace, this meant someone had deliberately staged the scene. Still, he had to follow protocol. Without a body, the investigation couldn't shift to a criminal case. In meetings with the county prosecutor, Wallace argued that the incident wasn't an accident or voluntary disappearance, but the response was consistent: no specific evidence of a crime. He felt frustrated watching the case file pile up among hundreds of unresolved missing persons cases. The veteran sheriff knew the longer time passed, the slimmer the chance of finding the victims. Despite the inconclusive forensics, Wallace continued gathering unofficial information. He re-interviewed party attendees about who brought the alcohol and whether anyone recognized the bottle from the vehicle. Some said Pierce often brought his own liquor, not sharing with others. Others recalled Linda taking Polaroid photos in the cabin before leaving, but no one knew where the film was. These scattered clues couldn't be logged as evidence, but helped Wallace form a theory that something had happened inside the cabin that night, with Pierce at the center of it all. When completing the preliminary report, Wallace accepted that the case couldn't yet be prosecuted. The file was sent to the state office with the familiar note: "Suspicious circumstances, no evidence of foul play confirmed." On paper, it remained a missing persons case, but in his personal notebook, Wallace wrote a different line. "The whiskey was spiked with sedatives. There's no reason for that unless someone intended it." To him, the forensics results, while not enough to convict, were a first warning that the girls didn't simply vanish, they may have been silenced. After receiving the forensics results, Wallace decided to reorganize all collected data to reconstruct the timeline of the night the girls disappeared. He spent nearly a week reviewing every witness statement, recorded time and location. His goal was to identify any gap in the party timeline that could pinpoint the last moment they were alive. Most witnesses said Linda and Maria were still in Pierce's cabin near midnight, leaving a few minutes later, with no one certain of the exact time. Wallace marked the window from midnight to 2 a.m. as the unaccounted period, no witnesses or concrete evidence of anyone's actions. Cross-referencing the terrain map, Wallace confirmed the shortest route from the cabin to the vehicle's discovery site was just over a mile, running along the lake's western shore before cutting to a small dirt road toward the dock. This was also a route Pierce frequently used to reach town, according to neighbors. The fact that Linda's Ford Bronco was found on Pierce's usual path led Wallace to believe the victims may have left the cabin with him, though under what circumstances was unclear. If it were an accident, the vehicle should have shown skid marks or crash damage, yet the scene was pristine. He began envisioning a scenario: someone drove the vehicle there, stopped, exited, and left by another means. To test this, Wallace returned to Pierce's cabin with 2 technicians. Pierce remained cooperative, allowing them to look around the property but not inside without a warrant. Wallace could only observe small details. The front porch wood was freshly painted, with a strong varnish smell. A window frame had light scratches, possibly scraped by metal. A pile of old wood lay behind the cabin, mostly discarded floorboards. When asked about the repairs, Pierce said the floor had termite damage, requiring a few boards to be replaced. Wallace requested samples from the discarded wood for analysis, and Pierce reluctantly agreed. The technicians collected 3 old boards for lab testing and noted other details. The ground around the cabin had been recently leveled, and a small path led from the porch to the back, toward the pine forest. Wallace marked this location on his map, noting it as a possible movement route. Results from the Nashville lab, returned 2 weeks later, revealed a tiny red fiber on one board surface. Under a microscope, it matched the synthetic structure of fibers used in summer dresses. Wallace compared it to a photo of Linda, taken in her apartment hours before leaving, showing her in a red dress of similar material. He sent the photo and fiber to the State Evidence Analysis Center for comparison. The results confirmed the fiber from the cabin matched the dress's composition and dye, likely from the same production source. This finding wasn't enough to charge Pierce, but for Wallace, it was the most critical piece of the puzzle. The cabin was clearly linked to the victims. He believed it was where they spent their final hours before disappearing. However, without a body or signs of violence, all conclusions remained hypothetical. Wallace presented the findings in an internal meeting, stressing that the cabin should be considered the case's primary scene. Some colleagues agreed, but the state prosecutor deemed there was still insufficient legal grounds for a full search warrant. They demanded more physical evidence confirming the victim's presence there. Wallace knew waiting longer risked losing any remaining traces. Despite procedural limits, he preserved all collected evidence: wood samples, the fiber, scene photos, and the route map. In his report to the state, he wrote a concise conclusion: the distance between David Pierce's cabin and the vehicle's discovery site is 1 mile. This route matches his usual travel path. Signs of floor repairs and the fiber found at the cabin match the victim's clothing. The cabin is considered the last likely point of contact between the suspect and the missing persons. Wallace paused longer than usual before signing. He knew he had built the case's timeline, but hadn't uncovered the critical part: what happened inside that cabin. In September 1976, as the missing persons case began to cool, a hunter from Sevier County called the sheriff's office, reporting something unusual near Pierce's cabin. During an early morning hunt, he noticed a patch of ground behind the pine trees behind the cabin had been recently disturbed. The dark soil, tinged with the smell of rotting wood and burnt debris, stood out from the surroundings. Wallace immediately went to the site with 2 officers and a forensic technician. They confirmed the area showed signs of digging and refilling, roughly a square meter, with the surface not yet compacted. A broken shovel head lay among the grass. Nearby, faint truck tire tracks led down and turned around. After photographing the area, the team decided to conduct a test excavation. Wallace ensured all actions followed protocol to avoid damaging potential evidence. The soil was removed, layer by layer, and at about 30 centimeters deep, a dark, decayed fabric appeared, followed by a small, shiny object reflecting sunlight. The technician picked it up, brushed off the mud, and handed it to Wallace, a silver bracelet engraved with LC on the inside. Nothing else was found: no bones, no other personal items, just soil and dry roots. The evidence was sealed and sent to the forensics lab. While awaiting results, Wallace reviewed the missing persons file. Linda Carver's listed belongings included a silver bracelet with engraved initials. Her mother confirmed Linda wore it for years, rarely taking it off, describing a small leaf pattern around the edge and a slightly loose clasp, perfectly matching the item. When the lab results arrived, Wallace knew it was no coincidence. The silver matched the type made by a small Knoxville jewelry shop where Linda had shopped. This strengthened the theory that the victims had been at the site behind the cabin, but raised a new question: why only the bracelet, with no other traces? Wallace ordered further excavation, expanding the radius by 2 meters. After 2 days of continuous digging, they found only decayed wood and a rusted metal can, no human remains. The deeper soil was hard and dry, showing no signs of deeper disturbance. Someone may have buried something there, then moved it elsewhere. At the station, Wallace presented the findings to the prosecutor. Though the bracelet was significant, it wasn't enough to prove a crime. Pierce could claim Linda dropped it during a visit to the cabin. No witnesses confirmed when the ground was dug. The prosecutor declined to issue a full search warrant or arrest. The case once again hung in a stalemate between suspicion and lack of evidence. Still, Wallace didn't stop. He created a detailed scene map, marking the bracelet's location, the path to the forest, and the distance to the nearest lake shore. It took about 2 minutes to walk from the cabin to the site, and at night, the cabin's window light would be enough to see the path. This led Wallace to theorize that if someone carried something there, they could have done so in the dark without a flashlight. The shallow burial depth suggested haste. He believed the site was used to temporarily hide evidence, possibly clothing or personal items, before being moved. In his comprehensive report to superiors, Wallace wrote, "The area behind the cabin shows recent digging, with evidence found being a silver bracelet engraved with initials matching victim Linda Carver, no signs of bodies or other evidence. Preliminary conclusion, the area may have been disturbed post-disappearance." He also recommended continued surveillance of Pierce, as he might return to tamper with the site if he knew police were watching. Though the discovery brought new hope, the case didn't advance further. Without a body or direct testimony, everything remained hypothetical. By month's end, the search was officially paused. The file, updated with the new evidence, was placed in temporary storage. Wallace sat alone in his quiet office, looking out the window at the distant mountains. He knew physical evidence might still be around the lake, but weather, water, and time would soon erase any traces. The small silver bracelet became the only remnant, proof of a woman's existence, marked by 2 engraved initials. By late 1977, after over a year of searching and investigating, the Sevier County Sheriff's Office was forced to suspend the missing persons case of Linda Carver and Maria Castillo. Without bodies or direct evidence of a crime, all efforts to gather proof hit dead ends. Wallace's final report, nearly 100 pages long, summarized the investigation from the vehicle found by the lake, the whiskey laced with sedatives, to the silver bracelet behind the cabin. All pointed to possible criminal activity, but lacked legal grounds for prosecution. The file was classified as unresolved missing persons, joining dozens of similar cases from that decade. Internally, such cases were called dead files, where time gradually erased clues and witnesses. Wallace protested the decision to close the case. But his words carried little weight. With a limited budget and thin manpower, the state prosecutor deemed it unsustainable to continue funding a case lacking solid grounds. After multiple failed appeals, Wallace had to accept reality. The collected evidence, the whiskey bottle, glass cups, red fabric scrap, and silver bracelet, was sealed and placed in the county's storage. Before handing it over, Wallace quietly kept copies of all investigation records, along with a few scene photos he had taken himself. He told the clerk, "This case isn't done, it's just sleeping." In the years that followed, Wallace stayed in Sevier but rarely appeared in public. He worked as a security consultant for a small insurance company and occasionally lectured at the State Police Academy. During each session, when discussing investigation protocols, he would softly say, "The biggest mistake is thinking there's no crime without a body." The phrase became a familiar reminder among local law enforcement, though few knew it stemmed from the Douglas Lake case. As for David Pierce, he left the cabin just months after the failed excavation. The wooden house was sold to a young couple, and Pierce moved to Sevierville, less than 30 miles away. Civil records noted he opened a small shop, selling used musical instruments, living quietly with little interaction with neighbors. To outsiders, he was just a polite middle-aged man, occasionally seen at church on Sundays. No one in his new community knew of his past, or the disappearance at Douglas Lake. In 1980, Wallace took early retirement due to heart issues. On his last day at the sheriff's office, he took a box of old files, including copies of the case and his personal notes. When colleagues asked why he kept them, he simply replied, "I don't want it forgotten." He moved to a small house near the Smoky Mountains, living alone, occasionally contacting old colleagues. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, no one mentioned the disappearance anymore. The file sat untouched in storage, labeled 7607DL, gathering dust on its cover. Occasionally, Wallace opened his old notebook, reviewing pages written in slanted handwriting with fading ink. He kept the Douglas Lake terrain map, marked in red ink with 3 points: Pierce's cabin, the patch of ground behind it, and the vehicle's discovery site. To him, these formed an unclosed triangle, only complete when the bodies were found. But as years passed, those involved scattered, witnesses lost contact, and evidence decayed with time. By the early 2000s, the county's old storage was moved to a new building, and many old files were discarded due to mold. The 1976 disappearance file survived, but drew no attention. In the tracking log, a brief note read, "No new leads. File remains inactive." The case, along with the people tied to it, was buried in over 4 decades of silence, existing only in faded notes on old file covers and the memory of a retired sheriff. In the summer of 2019, Tennessee faced its worst drought in years. Douglas Lake's water level dropped to a record low, exposing wide swaths of mud, once submerged deep underwater. Utility companies, managing the hydroelectric dam, took the opportunity to perform maintenance on embankments and clear the lake bed. One late July morning, workers near the western shore, once a fishing and small boat mooring area, spotted an odd object half buried in the mud, resembling old fabric or a blanket tangled in roots. Initially thought to be debris, when pulled up, the mud fell away to reveal human bones. Recognizing they might be remains, the site manager halted all activity and contacted local police. Sevier County police quickly cordoned off the area and called in the Tennessee State Forensics team. Upon careful excavation, they uncovered not one but 2 sets of skeletal remains, lying side by side, wrapped in decayed blanket fabric. Nearby were a few small items, a tarnished silver bracelet and a red fabric scrap caught in roots. Both skeletons lay parallel, facing the lake, less than 3 meters from the shore. The degree of decay and mud encasement suggested they had been there for decades. The items were carefully collected and sent to the Nashville Forensics Lab. The analysis took nearly 3 months. Bone, tissue, and fabric samples were examined using modern DNA technology. The final results confirmed DNA extracted from the bones and teeth matched biological samples from relatives of Linda Carver and Maria Castillo. There was no doubt. The 2 sets of remains found on the western shore of Douglas Lake were the women who vanished in the summer of 1976. From that moment, Case File 7607DL was officially removed from the missing persons list and reclassified as a homicide investigation. The forensics team dug deeper into the samples. They recovered a few intact hair strands containing traces of barbiturates, the same sedative group as the phenobarbital found in the 1976 whiskey bottle. Toxicology experts analyzed residual levels in the bones and concluded both victims had been dosed with a high amount, enough to cause unconsciousness within minutes when combined with alcohol. The compound's even distribution indicated it wasn't incidental exposure, but deliberately ingested, with intent. The report detailed the condition of the remains: no stab wounds, cuts, or sharp object injuries, no skull fractures, joints intact, with no breaks from heavy impact. All evidence suggested they didn't die from direct violence. Another noted detail: fine mud sediment in the lungs and nasal cavities indicated the victims inhaled water while alive, meaning death by drowning. Combined with toxicology results, the forensics team determined the cause of death as drowning after being rendered unconscious by sedatives. Criminal technicians used body position reconstruction on a terrain map. Based on decomposition and mud coverage, they calculated the bodies were buried at the lake's edge, hours after death, before the water rose again. This meant the perpetrator was at the site the night the women disappeared. The marked location matched the area Wallace identified in 1976 as the route from Pierce's cabin to the shore. While analyzing evidence, the forensics team recovered a small portion of the fabric wrapping the bodies, light brown synthetic fiber, commonly used for blankets in the 1970s. Under a microscope, the fabric showed tiny wood varnish particles, matching the type used in Pierce's cabin, per sample stored in the old case file. This similarity wasn't legally conclusive, but further tied the scene to the former suspect. When all results were compiled, the head of TBI's forensics unit signed a 15-page report concluding the victims died of drowning while unconscious, with barbiturate traces in bones and hair. No violent injuries detected. Evidence of concealment includes wrapping bodies in fabric and burial at the lake's edge. The report was sent to the TBI director and Tennessee state prosecutor with a recommendation treat the case as intentional homicide with body concealment. In an internal review meeting, cold case unit investigators determined this couldn't be an accident. The fact that both victims were drugged and buried in mud indicated calculated, organized behavior. There were no signs of suicide or randomness. All chemical, geographical, and temporal evidence pointed to one conclusion: the two young women were poisoned, rendered unconscious, and taken to the lake, where they drowned. A November 2019 summary report stated, cause of death, drowning after being drugged. Manner of death, homicide. Case nature, intentional with body concealment. Wallace's old file was fully digitized and copied for the investigation. The case was updated in the system. Cold case #7607DL, homicide classification confirmed. After over 4 decades as a mysterious disappearance, the case of Linda Carver and Maria Castillo was officially deemed intentional homicide, paving the way for a new investigation into what truly happened inside the Douglas Lake cabin in the summer of 1976. After the forensics conclusion was released, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation transferred the entire cold case #7607DL file to its specialized unit in Nashville. The lead was assigned to Detective Laura Simmons, a 36-year-old veteran investigator known for handling cases dormant for over 2 decades. Renowned for her logical and meticulous analysis, she was often tasked with complex cases requiring scene reconstruction. For her, the Douglas Lake case was a unique challenge: a murder with no witnesses, no intact evidence, and nearly half a century old. Upon receiving the file, Laura read through all the old documents preserved by Sevier County Police. The typewritten reports on yellowed paper bore E. Wallace signatures on nearly every page. Though copies were faded, marginal notes showed a sharp intuition and grasp of details. Laura decided she needed to meet the man who pursued the case in the 1970s. Wallace, then 85, lived in a small house on the edge of Sevierville. He greeted Laura with initial wariness, but when she explained her purpose, his eyes lit up. From an old wooden cabinet, he retrieved a paper box containing his handwritten notebook and a hand-drawn 1976 cabin scene map. The blue ink had blurred, but markings C1, L2, and H3. For Pierce's cabin, the vehicle site and the patch behind the house remained clear. "I always believed it started at that house," Wallace said, his voice slow but firm. He handed Laura the materials, saying, "If you want answers, start with the floorboards." Back in Nashville, Laura cross-referenced Wallace's map with current satellite imagery. The cabin still stood, now owned by another family, in a sparsely visited area by Douglas Lake. She obtained a search warrant and re-examined the scene. In early March 2020, Laura and TBI's forensic team visited the cabin. The owners cooperated, allowing a structural survey. The house had been renovated multiple times, but the living room's wooden foundation remained original. When the carpet was removed, technicians noticed a darker wood patch, distinct from the rest. Under UV light, small droplet-shaped fluorescent traces appeared, stretching across the surface. Laura ordered a wood sample cut for analysis and expanded the inspection nearby. Beneath a second layer of flooring, they found dried, dark brown stains embedded in wood crevices, suspected to be blood covered up years ago. The sample was sealed and sent to TBI's DNA lab. The results, returned after 10 days, stunned the team. The DNA matched Linda Carver's genetic profile, stored from the remains analysis. Though the sample was small, isotopic analysis confirmed the biological material dated to the late 1970s. There was no doubt Linda's blood had been spilled in David Pierce's cabin. Laura immediately drafted a detailed report for her superiors, stating, "The living room area of the cabin contains biological traces matching the victim's DNA. The blood, found under replaced floorboards, proves the scene was tampered with and concealed. The cabin is confirmed as the initial incident site." For the first time in over 40 years, investigators had direct physical evidence linking a victim to Pierce's house. Reading Wallace's old notebook note, "Cabin, current suspect's residence, floorboards new varnish." Laura felt chills at the predecessor's accuracy. Everything Wallace suspected in 1976 was now scientifically confirmed. She called him to share the results. After a brief silence, he said softly, "I knew it. They never left that place." After the cabin excavation, Laura photographed the entire floor structure, preserved wood samples, and drafted a report confirming the old scene matched the original file's description. Her comprehensive report concluded, the Douglas Lake cabin, initial crime scene, with evidence of concealment and trace removal occurring around summer 1976. With those words, after over 4 decades, Wallace's belief was officially recorded in the case file. After establishing the cabin as the initial scene, Laura reviewed the old evidence list for anything strengthening the victim-cabin connection. In the 1976 file, she noted Wallace's brief remark, "Polaroid camera recovered from vehicle, undeveloped roll inside." This item, stored in Sevier County's evidence locker, had never been processed due to limited technology at the time. Laura contacted the storage unit and requested all camera-related evidence be sent to Nashville for modern analysis. The Polaroid SX70 camera, its brown leather case decayed, was found with the film roll intact in its tray. Under dry storage, some chemicals in the film remain viable, allowing image recovery. TBI's imaging team used multispectral scanning and color reconstruction software, taking nearly 2 weeks to extract 3 clear frames. When the images appeared, Laura and the team stood frozen before the screen. The first showed Linda and Maria sitting side by side on a sofa, with wooden walls and bright floral curtains behind them. On the table were glasses, and a guitar leaned against a chair, details matching the description of Pierce's cabin interior in the old file. The second image, blurrier, showed the same room under dim light, with only a table lamp casting shadows. Maria leaned forward, seemingly speaking, while Linda turned away, holding a glass. At the image's edge was a man's silhouette by the guitar, wearing a dark cowboy hat. The third, shaky image pointed toward a window but captured the man's profile. When zoomed in, it showed a square jaw, thin mustache, and a small mole on the right cheek, matching David Pierce's 1975 file photo. The analysis team compared physical details in the images with recent cabin photos Laura had taken. The wood grain, curtain style, and window frame matched perfectly in placement and design. Even the guitar, a rare Martin D18, appeared in Pierce's 1976 property list. The technical report concluded, the location in the photos matches the interior of David Pierce's cabin from 1975-1977. Lighting and objects confirmed the photos were taken at night. To pinpoint the exact time frame, the imaging team analyzed the film's chemical structure. Based on fading patterns and silver halide composition, experts determined the film was exposed around July or August 1976, matching the disappearance timeline. All evidence converged: location, time, and individuals. The photos not only captured the final moments before the women vanished, but for the first time, placed the victims and suspect in the same frame. Laura printed the restored photos in large format, placing them alongside the crime scene file and Wallace's cabin map. Every detail matched to the centimeter: the window's position, the curtain's orientation, the guitar, and even the pattern on the glass cups, identical to those found in the Ford Bronco. She added a note to the file. Recovered Polaroid photos, direct visual evidence of victims inside suspect's cabin prior to disappearance. With her investigative experience, Laura understood the value of these images. In cold cases, photographs are often the most undeniable evidence, as they capture physical truth, not reliant on human memory. She contacted Wallace again to share the news. On the other end, his aged, raspy voice carried emotion as Laura described what she saw. "I knew it," he said slowly. "They were there. Now we can prove it." For Wallace, 43 years of waiting were distilled into a few blurry photos. In her comprehensive report to the TBI, Laura concluded, visual evidence recovered from the Polaroid film confirms Linda Carver and Maria Castillo were present in David Pierce's cabin on the night of their disappearance. The third figure in the photos matches David Pierce's identifying features. Interior details confirmed the location as the suspect's cabin. The report was signed, verified, and filed with the DNA evidence. After nearly half a century, the forgotten photos in the Polaroid camera became the pivotal piece, providing the first visual proof that the victims were in the Douglas Lake cabin, the place where their lives ended in the summer of 1976. With the photographic evidence confirmed, Laura reviewed the list of attendees from the 1976 party. Most had left the state or passed away, but one name appeared repeatedly in the old file: Brian Osborne, David Pierce's close friend and associate at the time. Wallace had interviewed him, but his vague statements then raised no red flags. Old address records showed Osborne left Knoxville in the late 1980s, working at a music shop in eastern Tennessee. Laura had the resident tracking unit cross-check the information, and within days, they located him in Johnson City, living in a small suburban nursing home. When Laura met him, she found a frail, silver-haired man sitting on a porch overlooking a garden. At 78, Osborne's eyes remained sharp. After Laura introduced herself and her purpose, he was silent for a long moment before nodding, saying he had been waiting for this day for years. In his small room, Laura opened a copy of the case file and the restored Polaroid photos. When Osborne saw the image of Pierce in a cowboy hat beside the two girls, he shook his head, his voice low. "I remember that night. It all started in that room." He recounted that on that evening, David Pierce invited a group of friends to the cabin to listen to a new recording. The party was small, with whiskey and country music playing from a cassette player. Linda and Maria, introduced by a mutual friend, arrived late, smiling and polite. Pierce paid particular attention to Linda, constantly pouring drinks and urging her to drink. Osborne distinctly recalled Pierce always carrying his own bottle, not letting others touch it. "I thought he was just showing off," Osborne said. "But then I saw him pour something from a small vial into the blonde girl's glass." Linda drank halfway, then said she felt dizzy and needed to rest. Maria, concerned, helped her friend to the sofa. The cabin's atmosphere shifted. A few guests left early, leaving only Osborne, Pierce, and the two girls. According to Osborne, Pierce laughed, saying Linda was just drunk, and turned the music louder. Maria seemed confused, wanting to take her friend home, but couldn't find the car keys. Osborne said he felt uneasy, stood up, and announced he was leaving. As he left the cabin, he saw Linda slumped over the table, Pierce sitting beside her, pouring more whiskey. Maria stood near the door, her face fearful. "She looked at me, but didn't say anything," he said. "I just nodded and walked out." Osborne insisted he left the cabin around midnight, driving back to his home in Knoxville, nearly 40 miles away. He didn't return the next day until Pierce called. In a brief call, Pierce said calmly that the girls had an accident, probably drove to the lake and lost control. Shocked, Osborne asked for details, but Pierce cut him off. "Don't get involved in this, I'll handle it." After that, they lost contact. When Laura asked why he didn't report it to the police, Osborne sighed. He said in 1976, Pierce had wide connections, knowing people in the music industry and some local officials. "I knew he was dangerous, and I was scared," he admitted. "When the disappearance hit the news, I thought about coming forward, but they never found the bodies. I thought maybe he was telling the truth, that it was an accident. But I always knew something wasn't right." Laura recorded his entire statement on audio and drafted a detailed report. She verified Osborne's timeline. It matched the gap Wallace had outlined, from the party's end to the vehicle's discovery by the lake. Osborne's account also aligned with forensic findings: barbiturates in the bones, no physical injuries, and blood traces in the cabin. Laura knew she had just obtained what the case lacked for 43 years, a direct witness. At the end of the interview, Osborne asked Laura to keep his name confidential until necessary. "I don't have much time left," he said quietly, "but I want this cleared up before I go." Laura shook his hand, promising to do so. On the drive back to Nashville, she replayed the recording, the old man's raspy voice, punctuated by pauses, each word carrying the weight of a buried past. In her report to superiors, Laura wrote, "Witness Brian Osborne confirms presence at the cabin during the incident. His testimony indicates suspect David Pierce spiked the victim's drinks, rendering them unconscious, and provides a timeline matching physical evidence. This is the first direct witness testimony in the case." Osborne's statement was copied and added to the cold case #7607DL file. After nearly half a century, the voice of a surviving party attendee provided the most critical piece of the puzzle, confirmation that the summer night of 1976 was not just a party, but the start of a deliberate crime. In March 2020, after Brian Osborne's testimony was verified and cross-referenced with all physical evidence, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation formally requested a search warrant for David Pierce's current residence. At 79, Pierce lived in Sevierville, about 30 miles from Douglas Lake. The 20-page warrant application included DNA results, forensic analysis, Polaroid photo evidence, and direct witness testimony. The state prosecutor approved it within 24 hours, recognizing it as a turning point in the 43-year case. On the morning of March 17, a TBI task force, joined by Sevier County Police, executed the warrant. Pierce's small house sat in a quiet neighborhood, with a wooden roof, white picket fence, and a backyard with maple trees. He opened the door when police knocked, appearing calm, not even asking why they were there. Holding a coffee mug, Pierce simply said, "I guess you've finally come." The team split into two groups. One searched the main floor, the other the basement and garage. Pierce's living room was unnervingly tidy. The walls displayed numerous framed photos of women, mostly shot in an artistic style, some appearing asleep, others with closed eyes. Upon closer inspection, they were all vintage Polaroids, the same film type as the restored roll from the case. In a desk drawer, technicians found several unprocessed Polaroid rolls, each labeled with sporadic dates from the 1970s to 1990s. Some frames were faded, but most showed young women lying on beds or sofas, appearing unconscious. Under UV light, several photos revealed they were taken in the same space, curtains, walls, and lamps, matching the Douglas Lake cabin. In Pierce's bedroom, officers found a small glass vial labeled phenobarbital sodium, 100 milligrams, from a pharmaceutical company that ceased production in 1978. The vial was nearly full, with tablets turned dark yellow. On-site testing confirmed the substance matched the toxin found in the victim's remains. Beside the vial was an old wooden box containing papers and notebooks. Among them, a black leather journal had a page marked with a paper dated 1976. Laura and a technician read the scrawled entries. That night, the light was dim. Both were fast asleep before I took them out. The water was colder than I thought. Another passage read, "No one asked, no one remembered. Only the lake keeps secrets." The fragmented lines clearly referenced the case. The journal was immediately sealed, listed as evidence item 14A. In the garage, the team found a large cardboard box containing old audio tapes and Pierce's demo music from his country music days. At the bottom were yellowed newspapers wrapping another Polaroid frame. A young woman lying motionless on a floor with wood grain identical to the Douglas cabin. Experts noted it could be one of the victims, though the image was too old to identify the face clearly. When the search concluded, the evidence list included 13 Polaroid film rolls, 28 loose photos, a phenobarbital vial, a personal journal, and other items tied to the 1976 case. All were sealed and transported to TBI's storage under Laura Simmons' direct supervision. That afternoon, an arrest warrant for David Pierce was issued. Police read his rights as he sat in his living room, still calm. When informed of the charges, first-degree murder and evidence concealment related to the 1976 disappearance, he didn't react, only smiling and saying, "You finally found what you wanted." He didn't resist as he was handcuffed, but his gaze held a mix of defiance and weariness. That evening, Pierce was transferred to the Sevier County Detention Center, pending interrogation. TBI issued a brief press release. Suspect David Pierce, 79. Arrested in Sevierville for murder and evidence concealment in cold case hash 7607DL. The case was noted as one of the oldest solved cold cases in Tennessee's investigative history. After over 40 years, the man once suspected and then faded from scrutiny was brought back to where he started, under the cold light of an interrogation room. David Pierce's interrogation took place at TBI's Nashville headquarters 2 days after his arrest. The room held 3 people: Laura Simmons, a state prosecutor's representative, and a clerk recording the session. Pierce appeared in a gray prison jumpsuit, moving slowly but with sharp eyes, showing no fear. He sat, hands clasped, and said calmly, "I have nothing to hide." Laura began by confirming his identity, then outlined the reasons for his arrest and the collected evidence. Pierce listened attentively, occasionally nodding, not interrupting. When asked about the night of July 1976, he claimed he only hosted a small party for a few friends, and that the 2 girls drank too much. He said, "Linda and Maria left the cabin around midnight, seeming to want to cool off by the lake." When asked if he went with them, Pierce shook his head. "No, I stayed to clean up." He denied leaving the cabin, spiking drinks, or being the last to see them. When Laura mentioned forensic results, showing barbiturates in the bones and blood traces under the cabin floor, Pierce only smiled. "You're talking about samples from nearly half a century ago. Who knows where those came from?" Laura placed the restored Polaroid photos before him. Images of Linda, Maria, and the man in a cowboy hat. Pierce glanced at them and shrugged, saying, "Back then, everyone wore hats like that. Nothing unusual. They could have taken those with someone else. I don't recall." When shown the third photo, zoomed in on a face matching his features, Pierce looked closer and gave a faint smile. "If you think that's me, fine." He neither confirmed nor denied, maintaining a half-defiant, half-mocking demeanor. The prosecutor asked about the Polaroid rolls and phenobarbital vial found in his home. Pierce explained he collected old cameras and pharmaceuticals for a personal collection. "I'm an artist. I like keeping things from the past," he said. "As for the pills, I used them for insomnia. At my age, who doesn't rely on medication?" His calm tone made the room's atmosphere heavy. Laura brought up Brian Osborne, the friend at the party. When she noted Osborne's testimony about seeing Pierce spike the drinks and being the last to see Linda conscious, Pierce's expression shifted noticeably. He sat up straight, stared at Laura, and asked, "Brian said that?" Laura nodded, reading verbatim from the recorded statement. Pierce was silent for a long moment, then let out a dry laugh. "He's 80, his memory's unreliable. You probably coached him to say what you wanted." When the prosecutor presented the matched findings, Linda's DNA under the cabin floor, barbiturates in the remains, and the journal note, "The water was colder than I thought," Pierce began to clench his hands, leaning back in his chair. He denied writing those lines, claiming the journal was an old poem, and insisted everything was speculation. When Laura asked directly, "Did you take the 2 girls to Douglas Lake that night?" he replied curtly, "No, they were drunk. Drove to the lake themselves, and something happened. I wasn't involved." Laura looked at him for a moment, then said softly, "But their vehicle was found just a mile from your cabin. No brake marks, no crash signs, and we have a witness who saw you washing your truck the next morning." Pierce shrugged. "I wash my truck every day. What's strange about that?" The interrogation lasted over 3 hours. Throughout, Pierce maintained his steadfast denial of all charges. When pressed on contradictions, he chose silence. At the end, when the prosecutor asked if he had anything to add before closing the record, Pierce only said, "No, I want a lawyer." After he was escorted out, Laura sat alone, looking at the photos on the table, the faces of 2 young women in dim light, and the man in the cowboy hat behind them. All evidence aligned: DNA, photos, testimony, drugs, the journal, all pointing one way. Yet the man across from her remained calm, as if 43 years had left no trace of guilt in his mind. In her report to superiors, Laura wrote concisely, "Suspect denies all charges, claiming victims were drunk and caused their own accident. When cross-referenced with physical evidence and witness testimony, this defense lacks basis. After interrogation, suspect remained silent and requested legal counsel. The record closed with David Pierce's scrawled signature below the typed line. Interview suspended. Suspect requested legal counsel. After the interrogation ended without a confession, the TBI decided to conduct a comprehensive supplemental forensic review to strengthen the prosecution's case. The goal was to accurately reconstruct the sequence of events from David Pierce's cabin to the location where the two sets of remains were found on the western shore of Douglas Lake. The TBI's digital forensics team collaborated with the forensic unit, using 3D crime scene simulation technology based on old measurements and the latest satellite imagery. They recreated the 1976 terrain using geological maps, archived aerial photos from state records, and Wallace's journal, which detailed distances, slopes, and the Ford Bronco's position. After over a month of processing, the scene model was completed. The cabin sat on a slope facing southwest, 1.2 miles from the water's edge, connected by a narrow dirt road wide enough for one vehicle. At the time of the crime, this road led directly to the muddy area where the remains were found. Simulating vehicle movement based on the slope and tire tracks from old scene photos, the results showed the vehicle couldn't have slid to that spot, as the incline lacked sufficient momentum. The tire track's abrupt stop near the lake and the right-angled steering indicated the vehicle was pushed by external force with the engine off. The technical report concluded, tire marks and movement trajectory rule out an accident. The vehicle was staged to simulate a false scene. The forensic team further analyzed soil and mud samples from the vehicle's tires in the 1976 file. Under an electron microscope, the silt particles matched samples from the area behind Pierce's cabin, less than 2 kilometers from the vehicle's discovery site. This match confirmed the vehicle had passed through that area before stopping at the lake. The forensic geologist's conclusion stated, no other soil source around Douglas Lake has similar mineral characteristics. The likelihood the vehicle originated from the area behind the cabin is over 98% reliable. Additionally, the cabin's floorboard samples where dried blood was found were compared to Linda Carver's and Maria Castillo's DNA, confirming a perfect match. Carbon isotope analysis dated the blood to between June and August 1976, aligning with the disappearance. The team also examined the red fabric found near the cabin and the fabric wrapping the remains. Results showed both were woven from the same synthetic fiber, produced by a Georgia textile company between 1974 and 1977. The fabric around the remains contained wood varnish particles and pine resin matching the cabin's floor material. The final verification involved the whiskey sample from the bottle found in the victim's vehicle in 1976, sealed for 40 years. It was compared using gas chromatography to the liquid in the bottle found at Pierce's home in 2020. Analysis confirmed both contained phenobarbital at equivalent concentrations with identical impurity ratios characteristic of a 1970s Memphis manufacturer. The fact that samples 43 years apart shared the same source suggested Pierce retained and used the drug consistently. When all data was compiled, the forensic team presented a simulation model of the crime sequence. In a 3D map displayed at a TBI meeting, simulated summer night light in 1976 illuminated the small wooden cabin, then traced the dirt road to the lake. The Ford Bronco appeared in the model, moving from the cabin, stopping at the shore, and being lightly pushed until its front tires touched the water. 2 objects representing the bodies were then brought out, wrapped in fabric, and shallowly buried in mud before the water rose again. The software calculated the entire process took about 40 minutes, feasible for one person with a vehicle. The 50-plus page report, signed by the head of forensics, the director of geological analysis, and the toxicology team leader, concluded 1. The victim's vehicle was deliberately moved and placed at the lake's edge to create a false scene to mislead the investigation. 2. David Pierce's cabin was the initial incident site, with biological evidence matching Linda Carver's DNA. 3. Fabric, soil, and whiskey samples directly link the cabin vehicle and remains discovery site, establishing a unified sequence of actions. 4. The toxic substance in the victims' bodies and the suspect's whiskey share the same origin. The report ended with scientific and physical data sufficiently establish intentional homicide with evidence concealment committed by suspect David Pierce between the night of July 17 and early morning of July 18, 1976. With this, cold case #7607DL was fully substantiated at the forensic level, providing a robust foundation for Tennessee's prosecutors to bring the case to trial after nearly half a century. David Pierce's trial began in early October 2020 at the Federal Criminal Court in Nashville, Tennessee, drawing significant media and public attention. It was noted as the state's longest-running cold case brought to trial with comprehensive modern forensic evidence. The large courtroom, with high ceilings and cold white light, was packed with reporters, investigators, and the victims' families. In the front row, Detective Laura Simmons sat beside former Sheriff Earl Wallace, now over 85, clutching his old notebook from over 40 years ago. Pierce entered in a gray suit, silver hair and glasses. Despite his age, he walked upright with a calm gaze. He didn't look at anyone, only nodding slightly to his defense attorney before sitting. When the judge read the charges, 2 counts of first-degree manslaughter and 1 count of evidence concealment, Pierce showed no reaction, crossing his arms. The prosecution opened with a concise but weighty summary. Lead prosecutor Helen Moore stated that the case is proof that time may blur memory but cannot erase evidence. She presented each layer of evidence: Linda Carver's DNA in Pierce's cabin, barbiturate traces in the victim's bones, Polaroid photos capturing them in the cabin the night they vanished, Brian Osborne's testimony confirming Pierce spiked their drinks, and the journal found in his home describing a night when the water was colder than I thought. She spoke slowly. No witness saw him kill, but every object testifies to it. Throughout the prosecution's case, investigators were called to testify. Laura detailed the Polaroid film recovery, how the images matched the cabin's interior, and confirmed the photos' timing aligned with the disappearance. She presented a comparison chart. The floral curtain and guitar in the photos matched items listed in the 1976 report. The DNA comparison was projected on a large screen. Graphs, charts, and a 3D simulation showed the route from the cabin to the lake. As Laura spoke, Wallace sat silently, gripping his old notebook. The line he wrote 40 years ago: cabin, current suspect's residence, floorboards, new varnish, now stood as an eerily accurate prediction. When Brian Osborne testified, the courtroom fell silent. Brought in by wheelchair, his voice was weak but clear. He recounted the summer night of 1976, the small party, the 2 girls, the whiskey, and the liquid Pierce secretly poured into their glasses. He recalled Maria's fearful eyes, and Linda slumped over the table. "I left because I couldn't stand the atmosphere," he said. The next morning, Pierce told me not to get involved, saying they had an accident. But I always knew he was lying. His testimony, though late, rang as the final living evidence of the past. The defense, represented by a private Knoxville law firm, argued that all evidence was a chain of assumptions spanning 4 decades. They stressed no witness saw Pierce move the vehicle or conceal bodies. They suggested the barbiturates in the victims could have been voluntarily consumed at the party, a common practice among youth. Then, they noted the blood in the cabin was minimal, possibly from an accidental injury. Regarding the journal, they claimed it was artistic writing, not a confession. In rebuttal, the prosecution addressed each point. They highlighted the matching whiskey and drug vial compositions, the vehicle's external force movement, not an accident, and the burial in mud as proof of intentional concealment. Moore concluded, "We don't need to have seen him push the vehicle to know he did it. Every piece of evidence points to one path, from the cabin to Douglas Lake, from life to death." The trial lasted 12 days. Media covered it relentlessly, dubbing it the Douglas Lake case. Pierce rarely spoke. When asked if he wished to testify, he said only, "I didn't kill anyone. They were drunk, drove off themselves. If they died, it's because they were foolish." The statement stirred the courtroom, while Wallace bowed his head, avoiding the defendant's gaze. On verdict day, the judge instructed the 12-person jury to deliberate for 2 hours. When they returned, the room was heavy with tension. The foreperson stood and read the verdict. Defendant David Pierce is guilty of first-degree manslaughter in the death of Linda Carver. Guilty of first-degree manslaughter in the death of Maria Castillo. Guilty of criminal evidence concealment. Pierce showed no emotion. The judge sentenced him to a total of 30 years in prison, with no parole eligibility for the first 15 years. The sentence was brief but symbolic. Justice, though delayed, had arrived. As the court adjourned, Laura stood quietly, feeling a mix of relief and emptiness. Wallace slowly closed his notebook, whispering, "Finally, they can rest." Outside, the early autumn wind rustled through maple trees, carrying the sound of dry leaves. After 44 years, the Douglas Lake case closed in that quiet, resolute sound, like the final breath of a story Tennessee thought was buried forever. After the verdict, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation released an official summary report on the Douglas Lake case. The 60-plus page document, signed by the TBI director, was publicly released under the title Cold Case #7607DL, A Study in Justice Restored. It described the case as a model for reinvestigating cold cases through DNA technology and interdisciplinary collaboration among forensics, digital analysis, and traditional investigation. The report acknowledged the efforts of generations of investigators, from Sheriff Earl Wallace, who opened the case in 1976, to Detective Laura Simmons, who led the final phase to bring it to light. The opening's final line read, "Justice may be delayed, but when truth is preserved, it is never buried." Local and national media covered the story extensively. Newspapers in Knoxville, Nashville, and Memphis published detailed analyses of the investigation, hailing it as a major forensic milestone for the state. One major outlet commented, "Without DNA technology and the resolve of those who followed, those two women would forever remain faded photos on a missing persons board." Tennessee Public Broadcasting produced a 1-hour documentary interviewing Wallace, Laura, and forensic technicians involved. In it, Wallace spoke slowly. "I don't call this a victory. We just finished the work left undone." In the small town by Douglas Lake, the community held a memorial for Linda Carver and Maria Castillo in spring 2021, 45 years after their disappearance. The county erected a gray granite memorial near the remains discovery site, inscribed in memory of Linda Carver and Maria Castillo. Lost July 1976, found 2019. Justice restored 2020. Beside it, 2 rows of young maple trees, planted by University of Tennessee students, symbolized the lives cut short. The dedication ceremony included multiple generations of law enforcement and locals. Wallace sat in the front row, eyes fixed on the calm lake. Laura stood beside him, delivering a brief speech. "We can't change the past, but we can ensure it's not forgotten." The event drew attention to Tennessee's unresolved missing persons cases. Under the governor's direction, the TBI launched the Legacy Review Program, reviewing over 200 dormant cases from the 1970s and 1980s. The goal was to identify cases with recoverable evidence or re-examination potential using modern DNA technology. In its first year, the program reopened 18 cases, identifying victims in 4 after decades. The TBI's internal report cited the Douglas Lake case as a model of success in managing, preserving, and recovering physical evidence over extended time. Several police academies in the state incorporated the case into their curricula, particularly in courses on evidence management and DNA technology in criminal investigations. Students were tasked with analyzing the sequence of events, from how Wallace preserved the original files to Laura's use of 3D simulation to reconstruct the crime scene. Experts regarded it as a model case for combining human intuition with scientific evidence. A forensic professor at the University of Tennessee commented, "If Wallace hadn't kept those files, no matter how advanced modern technology is, it would have been useless." This case proves the enduring value of every small detail in evidence preservation. For the community, the case's impact extended beyond the legal sphere. Victim advocacy groups in the state organized workshops named the Douglas Lake Forum to raise awareness about the importance of preserving biological data and maintaining contact with victims' families. The Carver and Castillo families were invited to share their stories of waiting and hoping. Linda's mother, then in her 80s, told the press, "I don't want to call this an ending. To me, it's a homecoming." The case also prompted Tennessee's legislative bodies to review evidence storage protocols. A new law was proposed, requiring criminal evidence to be preserved for at least 50 years or until DNA verification is completed. Passed in 2022, the Linda and Maria Law marked the first time in the state's history that a cold case spurred legal reform. At the TBI, a new storage facility named the Cold Case Archive was built to house evidence and digitized records of unresolved cases. At its center, File 7607DL was displayed in a glass case, accompanied by a brief note, "Resolved 2020, evidence preserved 44 years." Laura often visited when she had the chance, reviewing the faded Polaroid photos. To her, they were not just proof of a crime, but evidence of justice's resilience. The Douglas Lake case quickly drew attention from national and international criminal investigation organizations. The American Academy of Forensic Sciences 2021 annual conference dedicated a session titled "Justice After Decades." The Douglas Lake case study, detailing the reinvestigation process from analyzing remains to prosecuting the suspect. The presentation concluded that the case's success stemmed not only from technology, but from persistence and the belief that every piece of evidence, no matter how small, has a voice. When summer arrived that year, Douglas Lake returned to its quiet state. The rising water covered the muddy area where the remains were found, leaving only the memorial stone under the young maple trees. Locals often stopped to read the inscribed words, many leaving flowers or small notes. To them, the case was not just a solved crime, but a reminder of memory and responsibility. In the TBI's year-end summary, the director stated, "This case teaches us two things. First, no file is truly closed until the truth is found. Second, technology is only useful when people are persistent enough to see it through." The quote was cited in numerous articles, becoming the motto of Tennessee's cold case program. Over 4 decades later, the case of Linda Carver and Maria Castillo not only restored justice for 2 young women, but also opened a new chapter in how America approaches cases thought long dead. At the place where it all began, by Douglas Lake, Tennessee, the past was finally named, and the long silence was replaced by the echo of truth. The story of the Douglas Lake case is not just a journey to solve a murder buried for nearly half a century, but a reflection of the profound values of modern American society, faith in justice, the role of science, and the significance of human persistence. In this case, without former Sheriff Earl Wallace's meticulous preservation of the original files, the Polaroid camera and seemingly insignificant samples would never have been reanalyzed with modern DNA technology. That simple act became a symbol of the preserve the truth ethos, enduring through the years. In today's America, where speed, forgetfulness, and rapid media can overshadow events, this story reminds us that some truths require time and perseverance to be revealed. This lesson applies not only to investigations, but to everyone. Preserving data, evidence, or simply holding on to one's honest voice can be the deciding factor in righting future wrongs. The case also underscores the importance of technology and interdisciplinary collaboration, from forensics to digital and geological analysis, reflecting how modern American society uses science as a tool for justice. Above all, it's a story of moral responsibility, No one should bury a truth, whether in a lake or in memory. When the Tennessee community erected a memorial for Linda Carver and Maria Castillo, they honored not only two lost lives, but reaffirmed a shared American belief that justice may be delayed, but it never vanishes. If you believe justice never fades, subscribe to the channel to join us in exploring more cold cases hidden by time. Thank you for following the Douglas Lake case. See you in the next video, where another truth will be uncovered.